Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's event, Colonized Environments and Worldviews, Perspectives from Palestine and the Jawlan. My name is Marwa Daoudy, and I'm the Save Robash Chair in Arab Studies and an Associate Professor of International Relations at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome and introduce Dr. Muna Dajani to my class on the politics of water, and the students from class are here also with us today. And I want to introduce Dr. Dajani, who is a very well-known researcher on these issues. She is an action researcher with a background in critical political ecology. Her work aims to understand environmental and water governance through decolonial and critical lenses, and her research focuses on examining community struggles for rights to water and land in settler colonial context in Palestine and the occupied Syrian Golan Heights, with a special attention to farming practices and infrastructural politics and identity formation. This talk is set in our session titled Neo-Settler Colonialism and Resistance, and Dr. Dajani's work resonates with a lot of the themes we have been studying over the semester relating to legacies of environmental colonialism, environmental determinism, going back to the French and British colonialism, as well as Zionist colonization of Palestine's landscape and issues relating to climate justice in the Arab world. So Dr. Dajani will begin her presentation, and I want to thank here also Coco Tate, our program manager, who has organized all of this event and allowed Dr. Dajani to join us from London. And she will be drawing on her co-authored chapter with Omar Tasdel and Ala Iqtesh called Jawlani Political Ecology Being in Place, which was published in Mason and all. And she will be talking about Palestine as well as I said, the Syrian Golan, but also other topics. We will have a discussion because this class will be also on different topics relating to Gaza as well, and the current impacts of the genocide in Gaza on the environment and on the people. Then we will have time for questions from our students in the classroom, but also the online audience. For the online audience, I invite you to insert your questions in the question and answers box, and I will call on your question as we move along with the discussion. If you have any technical issue, please email coco@tate@georgetown.edu, and this information will also be in the chat. With that, let's begin. Dr. Dajani, the floor is yours, and welcome.
Hello, everyone. Well, good afternoon and good evening to the audience. And I want to thank Dr. Marwa Daoudy so much for the kind invitation to join you in the class today virtually, and also for the public lecture. It's really a big pleasure for me to be here. And I am really hoping that this will be a really nice conversation that we're going to have. Looking forward to constructive dialogue we will be having in the next hour and a half. And I wanted to kind of make the best use of the time by focusing maybe on just the presentation around 30 to 35 minutes. If I go overboard with the time, please let me know, because I really want to have it as an open conversation and to draw upon the readings as well that I might not focus on specifically in the slides, but we can talk about a bit later. And as Dr. Marwa has mentioned, in this current moment of the televised genocide that we have been witnessing for the past 400 days, it is impossible to not speak of the gravity of the reality on the ground in the besieged Gaza Strip, and to center what goes on, the genocide that is happening in Gaza as part and parcel of a process and a structure of colonial erasure of indigenous Palestinian presence on the land, and also continued extraction of Palestinian resources and livelihoods. So I would like to kind of emphasize that this will become a recurring theme throughout the presentation that I will make now. And I will also look at other colonized geographies across Palestine as well, to showcase how this genocide is only an intensification of existing injustices. Oh, sorry, I didn't share my screen, which I usually do right away. Okay. So just to kind of introduce myself quickly, my name is Muna Dajani, and I'm a fellow in environment at the LSE in the Department of Geography and Environment. And I'm really delighted to be here. And I wanted to say something before I start with the presentation. Sorry, I've been sick for a few days. But before I start with the presentation, I wanted to kind of just give a bit of context of how I got into kind of speaking about the environment and water specifically in Palestine from a decolonial perspective. And it comes at a realization of how entrenched is the hegemonic control over our environment, over our natural resources by colonial, neo-colonial, and settler colonial powers, but also how much it is also about hegemony over ideas and worldviews and issue framing of the crises we are facing today, the multiple crises of climate change, of water scarcity, of environmental breakdown, and also societal fragmentation and breakdown. So from that lens, I think it's really important to, Palestine is a really powerful example of the manifestations of environmental discourses, colonial discourses, and colonial practices that are inflicted upon Palestinian people in terms of erasure and in terms of extractivism. So coming to this, as part of my research, I've kind of delved deeper and deeper into how important it is to kind of historicize Palestine, historicize water struggles in Palestine, and politicize water struggles in Palestine to avoid kind of accepting and acquiescence into kind of the hegemonic dominant framings that can also lead us actually to a situation of complete societal collapse and continued erasure. So I wanted with this lecture to kind of focus on three levels or three parts, sorry. First, I will kind of speak a bit more about colonized environments and how does that manifest in Palestine. But also sometimes I will oscillate between Palestine and the wider Jordan River Basin, including the occupied Golan Heights. Then I'll kind of have the entry point of water that has allowed me to kind of frame Palestine as an issue of struggles and resource politics. And then I will also speak a bit about how do colonized communities and colonized groups actually encounter, resist, and confront settler colonial violence through their everyday acts of resistance and being on the land. So I will start with part one. And I think part one for me, and I'm really sorry, I feel like sometimes I tend to rely a lot on pictures, but I hope that the narration of the story remains very clear. So when we speak about colonized environments, so it has to be understood as a process that happens on multiple cognitive levels. Then it is environments are colonized when they are first envisioned in the imagination of the colonizer. And that imagination of the colonizer is our like the terra nullius, the lands that are open, free for colonial modernity to be enacted upon it, for a separation between nature and humans. And it's also always imbued with ideas and tropes around that are around racism, a dehumanization of indigenous people, kind of a designation of indigenous livelihood and indigenous cultures as primitive and requiring intervention and requiring enlightenment. So this is not a relic of the past. It's actually very alive and real in the world we live in today. So envisioning that worldview and that framing remains completely very, very hegemonic in the world we live in today. Then the enactment of colonizing environment happens through different means and forms. Of course, that requires a complete transformation of environments. It relies on law. It relies on regulation, it relies on policies, and also on infrastructure, military occupation, and colonization to actually concretize that control over the environment. So this continues to happen and continues to be sustained. The other aspect of it is sustaining that hegemony of ideas, of territorial control, and extractivism continues to be sustained in this neo-colonial world we live in today. And the picture that comes at the background of this slide is actually referring, kind of situating Palestine in this colonized environment framing, as it tells us that Palestinian colonization did not happen in one event or one-time event. It actually has a structure and a legacy that goes back to the beginning of the 20th century, where the Balfour Declaration happened in 1917 that allowed for Israel, for the Zionist project to flourish and to be sustained and to be supported, to enact colonization of Palestine, of course, to the detriment for the Palestinian population. So it also shows that, with that colonization comes the erasure of indigenous population, the replacement of this indigenous population with the settler population, and also the modernization project begins to take form and shape aggressively through concessions and through different means, where capital is really flowing into those infrastructural projects that take on a very state-centric, very enlightened mission called that allows the settler colony to flourish. And why do I say these things? And I think it's really important. If we look at the situation that is going on in Gaza, the genocide that is taking place in Gaza can only be understood as an intensification, a very unimaginable intensification of ecological violence inflicted on Palestinians since those early days of the 20th century. And since those times, Gaza has been relegated into a condition of exclusion, right? It is a disconnected geography from the rest of the hinterland Palestinian geography. It's been framed as a humanitarian zone for a few decades now. And since the siege, most evidently since 2007. And it's since that time, and around the year 2012, it has been very repeatedly framed as becoming uninhabitable. The water in Gaza is undrinkable, it's unfit for human consumption. So all of these tropes and ideas and framings about Gaza being uninhabitable, rather than the actual settler colonial realities and the acquiescence of the international community that allowed it to happen. So I think this is really important. This also shows intention and deliberate intention to make uninhabitable that geography. And with that, of course, the population that lives in there, to render them only recipient of international aid and humanitarian support. So I really wanted to say that. And what it is doing as well, in addition to the ecocidal practices that we see today that are intentionally destroying the ecosystem for Palestinians to survive in Gaza, intentionally targeting water infrastructure, it's also aiming to severe relations with the land completely, severe relations with any means of survival. And I think I wanted to kind of assert that this is really important to kind of think of it as something that is structural, as something that is historical. And mending and severing of relations as well is not about kind of how much water is Gazans allowed to have in these days, but kind of thinking about what are Palestinians deprived of, in addition to being disconnected from their environment, in addition to being deprived of their right to water. There is something that is very much non-material and intangible that the Palestinians are being denied of. And what keeps it alive, of course, is the memory of those places, but also kind of the claim that Palestinians in Gaza are mostly made up of refugees, and these refugees also come from areas around the Gaza Strip. that were thriving villages and towns, and there was a very prosperous agricultural production that was already there. There was a strong relation with land and water that is no longer there. So I just wanted to finish this section because I feel it's important to frame what I'll be speaking about in the next section with this idea of the coloniality modernity. Yeah, is there something, a comment or no? Yeah, so just kind of also to think about why I find inspiration as well examining water infrastructure, whether it is water infrastructure of the settler colony or whether it is water infrastructure and its attempts of the indigenous. It is because it's about transforming landscapes into these colonial visions of, optimization, productivity. It's the idea of manufacturing scarcity for some and not for others. It centers the epistemological power within the realm of experts. So all of this are actually also characterizations of contemporary environmental governance, whether it's transboundary water governance, whether it's global environmental governance. It's all about, it all comes from the same premises of, the idea that there is scientific knowledge regarding certain issues, and the issue framing that these scientists are advising us about are the ones to be taken on board, while other visions and other worldviews are completely ignored. Same thing around kind of this idea of optimization of nature that separates completely nature from people, and the only let's say, aspect of nature is its utilitarian aspect. Nature is there to serve us. So I think this is really kind of important to situate and to speak about specifically before we kind of delve into, how do we actually, what is a colonized environment? How do people actually live through these colonized environment and worldviews, and how do we confront them? Because there are a few levels here to actually grapple with. So I think what I wanted also with this section, which is part 2, is to kind of delve deeper into, asking the right question, which political ecology inspires us to do. So basically by asking the right questions about, for example, framings of water scarcity in Palestine. For who is water scarce and how has it been scarce? Who manufactures scarcity? So we have to ask more kind of provocative questions around these issues. And who is leading the framing of that scarcity and how is it actually dealt with? So a lot of these questions were on my mind as well as a young engineer, graduating from Birzeit University, and then kind of being confronted with a clear reality where somebody else is setting the agenda. And as knowledge holders, we were always kind of subordinate to a way of framing Palestinian water issues, for example. So it wasn't about, of course, it wasn't about settler colonialism. It was about, addressing issues of water scarcity that have been normalized. And then, trying to find solutions or like basically implement policies that are coming from international aid organizations to address this water scarcity. So there has been no confrontation with the daily realities of living under settler colonialism, where Israel actually is manufacturing scarcity for Palestinians. So this was kind of a moment for me to kind of reject that kind of hegemony over ideas that kind of really solidified Israel's hydrohegemony. So one thing I wanted to kind of say is why working on the Jordan River Basin, which is a basin that it's a transboundary river basin, like many basins around the world. It is shared by multiple nation states, not always nation state, but multiple entities, and it requires and it compels us to cooperate, right? So this dominant framing was a framing I was also kind of that I jumped into. Because I was interested in water, but found that it is really such a very limited framing, because it is also basically really confining us to kind of discourses around international relations, and engineering, which are both very masculinized discourses, very gendered in the way they see the world, in the way they frame issues, in the way they frame solutions. So one thing kind of to overcome this really interesting finding myself in transboundary water governance circles is to kind of delve deeper into the history. What happens when water infrastructure that is a very nation state centric projects, very large scale project that you don't even hear about beneficiaries of those projects, or you don't hear of local communities solutions to those issues. They are non-existent. So I felt that, okay, this is something that is a very, very problematic framing that I would like kind of to delve deeper into. And this is where kind of I started looking at water infrastructure, but from below, what I call water from below, which is basically kind of inverts the lens through which water issues are framed and through which water issues are addressed. So to kind of look at how people actually experience and encounter infrastructure. One of those large infrastructure is the national water carrier, which basically siphoned water from the water-rich north tributaries of the Jordan River. I hope you see my cursor. They basically built the largest infrastructure project in Israel to divert water that is not Israeli water, that doesn't within the confines of Palestine, out of the basin to make the desert bloom in the south, right? So it's crossing these hundreds of kilometers, and this infrastructure is violent in so many ways. It's violence against the environment because it's causing so much environmental degradation along the way. It's siphoning, taking water out of the basin, which was the first out of basin transfer that happened in the in this transboundary river basin. And it's building infrastructure that is very much exclusive. It's very much only serving the purpose of, bringing water to the desert, to the Naqab, to the Negev in the south, and making the desert bloom, right? And to making the Israeli settler colonial project a viable project. So my interest then, I could have stopped there, and said, okay, this is hydrohegemony. And it's taking place at the state-centric level. And it's all about, giving equitable share to all of the riparian countries, including Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine. But the thing is that it doesn't stop there, because Israel is not a normal state. It's a settler colonial state. And it has, visions that are wider than, just securing water for its own entity. And its borders, as we see, are very expandable because of the nature of its existence. So kind of looking at it from a different lens requires us to kind of understand what happens when water infrastructure is realized by nation states. How do people confront with that infrastructure, and how do they resist it? This has brought me to an area in the Galilee, which is inside 48 land, inside Israel. So it's a Palestinian community that remained on their lands and in their villages. And in the 1960s and 50s and 60s, when this huge project was being built, it came to their land. So it caused really a very large confiscation of land. It actually dominated the landscape where they live, and they resisted it in different ways by first not allowing it to be built, through kind of demonstrating, standing against the bulldozers and trying to stop it. They also kind of found other ways to engage with courts, with Israeli courts, to also confront this project and try to gain access to it and benefit from it, which was also an interesting encounter with that infrastructure. But eventually, because I'll take you now through different kind of geographies, and hopefully that will kind of make sense in terms of how these cases come together. But what eventually happens is that they are denied access to this very large infrastructure. They are denied access to that water to develop their own agriculture in the valley, in Al-Battuf Valley. And they also have to contend with and live with lack of drainage and lack of infrastructure that is still persistent until this day. So it's a lot of things that we can unpack actually when we examine water from below in that way. When we actually tell it from the narration and from the story, from the lived experiences of the population, rather than just from the state-centric framings. So this is a case inside 48. If we move along the geographies of Palestine into the West Bank, where evidently, and of course rightly so, there's so much attention on water also there. And because also there has been a manufactured water scarcity in the West Bank, and more increasingly and acutely, of course, in Gaza prior to 2023 October. But again, here, we can also look at it as a way of like, oh, there is scarcity in this geography. And to address this scarcity, we need to build infrastructure that is suitable. We need to increase water availability. All of this framing obfuscates basically that this is all manufactured, because the reality remains that Israel, for example, controls 80% of the aquifers, the groundwater aquifers. So the solutions that come to this water scarcity end up, tying Palestinians to certain infrastructures and to certain solutions. Sorry, just because this one's going to keep flicking. Certain solutions. And this itself, for me, is also another way to kind of understand how colonized, how water is colonized in the West Bank and Gaza and elsewhere, but through different means and forms. And there is a colonization of the worldview as well, or the issue at stake, which is water scarcity. Pushing international aid agencies, for example, to devise decades-long, interventions that don't seem to address the issue at hand, where even Israel continues to, for example, destroy some of this infrastructure that we see in the picture, and there is also a reconstruction cycle happening all the time as well. So I see this as also kind of contributing to suppression of Palestinian liberation struggle in general, because it also confines, our struggle to kind of ideas around, increasing water availability through infrastructural development, but happening in very confined spaces like Area A and B, while, for example, most of the West Bank, more than 60% of the West Bank, is denied infrastructure there. So there is also a lot here to kind of expose. Because it is very inherent in the way we frame issues and the way we devise solution for, and in the way at the end that it kind of actually weakens Palestinian communities' struggles to remain on the land and to confront, environmental changes and climate changes, actually. So there is a lot here that we need to also pay attention to. And then there also comes, more issues of framing that I think are really important, that are inherent to the settler colonial project, because if we think of the way that we have framed water issues all across Palestine, but mostly focused on like West Bank and Gaza, is to think of it as, as experiencing water scarcity that is where we need to compare. So Israel or Israeli settlers or Israelis in 48 land are using this much water, then the WHO minimum is this much, and Gaza is getting less and less. West Bank gets also a quarter maybe of what the Israeli settlers are getting. And I feel like this is really an important framing to kind of expose the reality, the actual material reality. But what it also still lacks, and we continue to expose further, that there is weaponization of water, and it is designed to inflict more harm and to inflict thirst as a normal condition, to normalize the idea that Israel can cut off water from Gaza, like it did in October, for example, to turn off a big tap, to maybe through its settler population and through its military and Israeli water company, to be able to kind of take over springs, for example, take over water sources by Palestinians to make their life uninhabitable, to cause harm and suffering. And I think these are also other manifestations of colonization that we usually like don't speak about, that harm that is inflicted on communities where they have to kind of either maybe relocate, leave area C to go to areas where water can be more reliable, leave their agricultural practices behind, and maybe even like completely leave Palestine as well. So this is this Auja Spring in Jericho is the most recent manifestation, because Auja Spring has always been kind of a very proud location in the heart of the Jordan Valley for Palestinians, like, and that water used to also serve Palestinian families. It's also a leisure point, but increasingly now, since 2023, Israeli settlers have been coming violently to scare people off, to break water infrastructure pipes that Palestinian farmers have, and to claim water in that sense of the word. It's claiming not only kind of a physical presence, but also kind of that hegemony, that there is power there that you cannot escape, you know, that we can make your life uninhabitable. So these are all like different places where that encounter is happening. But most interestingly, that all of these are happening, and they are being countered and resisted. And even water infrastructure is being built to actually counter that hegemony of colonized environments and worldviews. And I wanted to kind of highlight a few snippets, and I hope time is not a lot. I'm not delayed a lot, but these are just one of the last slides that I want to highlight here. Is that in order for us to kind of think about countering first the settler colonial infrastructural imposition on Palestinian water, and to also counter and confront these the dominant worldviews that kind of relegate Palestinians to recipient of water when Israel feels that they are that they deserve this water and cut it off when they're not. There is a lot of actions that I feel are centered around people and are centered about communities resisting, rather than always kind of around the idea of like claiming water itself. So the ideas range from very multiple ways of claiming rights to water that I feel kind of go beyond the that I said, the state-centric approach, the colonial understanding of claiming rights to water, or like controlling water, is by controlling first the means of production as much as possible, but also kind of reclaiming rights to be in the space. So this happens through different ways. There is a lot of agricultural farms that are growing, that are youth movements that are happening around issues of food sovereignty, where Palestinians are reclaiming claims to land and to water, where they're setting up their agricultural farms. There is also the fact of being present on the land in different ways around water springs, for example. There's also Saqiya, which is in the West Bank near Ramallah. And it's also around, you know, producing decolonial knowledge and making sure that when we mend relations with land and water, that it doesn't also replicate modes of colonial framings and worldviews. And the acts of foraging, the acts of also being in the mountains, foraging for wild plants, like if you have seen the film Foragers and others, they talk about it. And in the chapter, we also speak about, you know, how people in the Golan Heights also have tried to reclaim a space for themselves in that colonized space, in their colonized lands itself, and whether it's water, which I will speak about in a bit. So there are these pathways through which reclamation can happen, and I'm arguing that they can take different forms, and they don't always have to be successful. Maybe they don't always have to be even sustainable in a way or long term. But what it is important that it is timely, and this is what we mentioned in the chapter as well, is that it is about time. It's about claiming the right to be in that space, in that place, in time, and on the times that we agreed to, in a way. I wanted to say that also there is a lot of ways of countering and countering that settler colonial environment, where in the Galilee, where their attempts to actually build infrastructure and develop their agriculture the way they want has been thwarted by the Israeli authorities, they find different ways of maybe going back to growing a very traditional crops and kind of looking at baladi, what we call baladi, which is more like traditional seasonal fruits and vegetable varieties, mainly vegetable varieties, or like just being on the land and sowing whatever is possible and then claiming it as a space to be Palestinian present on the land in the heart of the Galilee, where it's surrounded by lots of settlements and lots of attempt to turn their valley into an ecological park. In the Golan Heights, and I wanted, this would be the last example, and I'm sorry if I'm taking longer, but in the Golan Heights, I think what is really very interesting and such a powerful example of countering and resisting and finding your place in such a colonized environment, because the Golan Heights is a space and it's a geography that has been almost exclusively ethnically cleansed, except like a few small villages, and the Jawlani population there only existing in 5% of the occupied Golan Heights, which was turned into Israeli agricultural settlement and so many other facilities that is extracting a lot of resources from the land. They have also had their encounter with that settler colonial attempt of erasure, and they have resisted by building what I call counter infrastructure, and the fact that growing apple trees became such an important part of their identity. So I think in those small kind of how do you say, like openings, that when we find that settler colonialism grip is so entrenched, it's so impermeable. This is where the openings are happening, where people are trying to forge new ways of being on the land, maybe, and also to remend relations with the land and with human, non-human actors as well. So building infrastructure, developing that into infrastructure in order to maintain and continue their agricultural production became not only a necessity for the Jawlani survival, but it became, an act of claiming identity, because this population is a Syrian population that has been completely cut off from Syria. So how do they claim their Syrian identity? Of course, it's by acknowledging and asserting the identity ideationally, I mean, but what does it mean on the land? And I think this has been really such a powerful struggle to learn from, because they've managed to come across to mend that relation with the land in so many different ways. But that doesn't mean that settler colonialism stops, because there are new ways today where colonized environments are being further extracted under the guise today of green extractivism. The idea that we need wind energy to save us from the turmoils and from the catastrophes that are coming our way because of climate change. So that neo-colonial viewpoint and worldview is to push for more utilitarian approaches to nature. Like, let's find new ways to make the best use of environment for the sake of saving a very much an extractivist model of existence. So the Golan Heights, again, is coming at the forefront of resisting that wind turbine project through different ways. But I think what is really important is that how at the end of the day, the Jawlanis are also asserting their right to be on the land in the way that they desire. So their confrontation is against the wind project, but at the same time, it's also to mend relations with the land. Like a lot of the demonstrations that have happened there in the last few years were all about, that connection to the land, the idea that we plant trees in our land, we don't plant wind turbines. So kind of rejecting that state-centric, that settler colonial project that aims ultimately that doesn't see them, but also aims to erase them in the way of, realizing green colonialism. So I think I will stop here, and I hope I gave like an overview picture that I'm also kind of developing in my mind into how to frame all of these examples of geographies under colonialism, under settler colonialism, and how do they grapple with those that very much entrenched environmental extractivism, but also ideational power over what are environmental issues, what are our water issues, and how do we address them. And I wanted to end just quickly about Gaza because I thought I wanted to also bring an example where we also see Gaza beyond, the annihilation that Israel is carrying out against its ecosystem and its environment and its people and its future. And I wanted to kind of also bring into that framing that also confronts those colonized ideas and worldviews, is to kind of see how people are at the heart of that confrontation, and people are finding ways to confront starvation, to confront systematic thirst, to confront genocide by coming together, by cooking together, by devising ways to bring water to people who need it the most, to bring a hot meal to people. And I think this kind of we insist on, that these acts of mutual aid, they are led by people, and they actually embody what I have been trying to talk about since the beginning of the lecture, is that there is a need to mend relations with the land. Settler colonialism wants to sever those relations with the land and to really expose us as communities under colonialism. But what we can do is to try to mend relations with land and water and with each other and with our ecosystems, even under conditions of uninhabitability, trying to make it a little less uninhabitable. And I will stop here, and I'm happy really to kind of hopefully spark your interest in all of that framing and those case studies and talk more. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I'm going to let you, I will just want to make some links with our class discussions, let you take a pause now, drink some water, to say thank you for a brilliant lecture, which really echoes a lot of the readings we've had, the discussions we've had in this class. Really, your focus on the epistemological, discursive, and material manifestation of settler colonialism and the new forms of settler colonialism is something we have really discussed a lot in this class. Going back to the French-British settler colonial projects, which described, for example, the Arab world as barren, as arid, as uninhabitable, unless the white savior comes in and saves nature from its people, right? And we've seen that in Italy, in Libya, the French in Algeria, and of course the British in Palestine, but also the Zionist settler colonial project in Palestine, thinking about this, making the desert bloom, but before even 1948, describing the land as populated by backwards natives who don't know how to manage their own resources if they're not actually absent. So there's a dichotomy here between the different narratives, right? Either they're not there, they're completely absent, they're erasure, or they're there, but they're backward and they don't know how to manage their resources. And I think it's very important how you focus on resistance as well. How natives, indigenous people resist. Their relation to the land is crucial, and it's been disrupted, it's been violated, but how they have means to resist. And we also had a reading this week about the relation to Jabal al-Sheikh in the Jawlan and the Syrians under occupation, and they're often invisible and forgotten. And they feel very much Syrian, right, in their relation to the Jawlan, and they still have the resistance through their lack of, acceptance of the citizenship, the Israeli citizenship, and their Syrian identity. I think your notion of infrastructural power, which is usually a state-centric, right, form of power, how you reverse it and look at it from the resisting party is also very interesting. And food sovereignty, of course, is a crucial. We had a documentary called The Queen Seed of Palestine, showing the relation to the olive trees, very important for Palestinians, without being romanticized, right? We have also this idea that it doesn't have to be romanticized, but it's actually very present. And waking up this morning to the news of the Israeli army going in the West Bank and destroying all of these olive trees, the cost, the emotional, psychological, historical cost for Palestinians is also very important. I also want to mention something we discuss a lot is the narratives, which you mentioned, issue framing, how Israel also presents itself as a pioneer, drip irrigation, modernity, etc. And since a while also as greenwashing, this wind energy in the Jawlan, which is done on stolen land, which, people who think that's positive, but it's done on stolen land. So all of that is very, very important. Thank you so much. I'm going to open the floor now to our questions. I'll take 2-3 questions from the students, then you'll answer, if you don't mind, Mona, and then we'll go to the online audience. Who would like to start? Rory? Yes.
Yes. Hi, Dr. Dajani. Thank you for joining us today and for speaking with our class. One question I did have while reading your chapter is, how did the occupation and Israeli restrictions of movements impact your methodology for the research that you were doing?
Thank you. I'll take another question. No, so I have one online, I believe, an online question. Sorry, let me see.
I'm happy to ask a question as well.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I just needed to make sure I had all my notes. You talked a little bit about how environments are colonized beginning with imagination. And you talk a little bit about how the name that we refer to this area as is very important, but also maybe there's something else that's important. Could you speak a little bit more to that and how naming of occupied Palestinian territories is done, how it impacts the people who live there?
Did you hear, Mona, the question? I just want to summarize if the online audience didn't hear. So the first one was about methodology carrying research under occupation. What is the methodology here? And the second one is about the naming, right? The framing and the naming in those circumstances.
Great, thank you for these great questions to start the discussion. I just wanted to say just quickly that this is something that I've kind of wanted to say so much in that lecture, but I hope it also allows you we can now just bring in any case you think that wasn't given enough attention. But yes, definitely on the question of methodology, and I think it's really a great question because it is something that has shaped my my commitment to research and commitment to Palestine was that I was also under the impression, in a way, because of it, I think, as I mentioned, how hegemonic is that ideational power around, the West Bank and Gaza being Palestine. For me, as a young engineer, as I mentioned in the beginning, the idea was that this is the framework, and this is the geography, and this is how I'm going to do research. Again, looking at water from a state-centric perspective, trying the best to make it the most equitable distribution of water. And that, I think, the shift happened is because again, I'm from Palestine and I could access many of those areas except Gaza, that I managed to also widen my framework and understanding of the realities of settler colonialism, first of all, and second of all, how water, water colonization or that grip over water does not happen in certain geographies, it happened elsewhere. And this has also opened my eyes to kind of doing research differently through storytelling, through archives, through kind of navigating and understanding history. And that kind of shifted my methodology. But I do also, having said that, living under occupation does not allow you to be a normal researcher. You can tell that there might have been other non-Palestinians who could have more access than you as a Palestinian, or kind of have that privilege of entering and doing research and engaging on a much wider scale than a Palestinian researcher. So those limitations still continue to be. But I think, I think living under occupation also allows you to kind of find ways, devise also ways and ways of thinking to confront it. That happened gradually. For me, it happened gradually, as I mentioned, from that young age until today. And then, the naming and the framing, I think it's really important because like Dr. Marwa has mentioned, as well, if we think about how Palestine has been framed as a site of, as a land, abandoned, as a land that is primitive, that hasn't been utilized to its best optimal use, and benefit by the indigenous population. There is here this kind of how do you say that, not insecurity, but this feeling of being inferior, right, in our relations with the land. And this is being confronted today, I think, very much. It's very, in those dark times, it's very hopeful, because for a long time, it has been either romanticized, like Marwa, you mentioned, but it has also been or like framed as being being like very ineffective, you know, like a return to the land, or framing issues as water, for example, water appetite, or thinking of you know, water injustice beyond West Bank and Gaza, or thinking of the frame of settler colonialism, have all been not necessarily rejected, but there have always been questions whether they are really like useful frameworks to take, because we want practical solution. You want to be on the land. You want to have sovereignty over your resource. You want more access to resources. So I think, I don't know if I'm answering the question, but I think this also adds to that imagination. That framing is so dominant that we also find ways to kind of how do you say, like not be like very convinced that this is the way we should go, because it either to like just romanticizing a situation that is not possible to keep believing in, or a practice that has really become obsolete, for example. But as I said, it's like that is being rejected so much. And I feel, of course, since the genocide began, it's much more powerful as well, in the way that people are more bold about the framing, the problematics of, you know, colonial framing of our environmental issues, a colonial framing of an ecocide even. You know, what is ecocide? Is it just an event that happens during a war, or like a time of, you know, a violence, or is it very much subtle? Is it very much continuous? So I think a lot of these kind of ideas are being rejected, and rightly so, and they should be done much more. Again, we can maybe talk a bit about it if I missed that question, but yeah.
This is why research carried out by yourself and other Palestinian researchers is a form of resistance, right? Bringing that knowledge, bringing that voice and amplifying it. But also you developed in your co-author chapter the concept of makaniye, which is also bringing a new framework when it comes to the Jawlan, right? Like this idea of the landscape being shaped by both human and natural, you know, triggers, and how the Jawlanis relate to their own land, and the Palestinians as well, is a way of countering this hegemony of the narratives. Do you want to tell us more how you came about this framework?
Yeah, and I think Makaniya, of course, Omar Tasdel, who is kind of the founding or the one that coined the term, along with a few researchers in the West Bank. And I think it's really important, like how Makaniya is all about, first of all, again, it goes beyond the physical. It is about being in place, but it's about embodying that being, right? It's about being in place with all of your senses, being in place with all of your ancestral heritage and knowledge, but also being in a place that is not yours, or that has been taken, stripped away from you in very violent ways. So, for example, one of the examples in the chapter we look at is the nature reserves. You know, how Jawlanis were forced to pay a ticket to enter the nature reserve, to visit places that they come to know for a generation, that they had different relations with. And this kind of course, resonates maybe with like indigenous and First Nation experiences of alienation from place while being in place. You know, that is the conundrum. You know, that is kind of the dilemma where Makaniya is offering us, you know, that what I understood, and kind of the engagement with Omar and with Ala, is to kind of think of how do we be in place in a reality that very much is alienating us, you know, every day in different ways, and sometimes very violent ways, and other times in very sinister, very subtle ways, like what happens in the Golan, which is kind of a way where it's less violent. So it's never, you know, a direct confrontation like what happens in the West Bank, where settlers come in and they torch trees, and they also kind of they shoot Palestinian farmers, they steal water. So that is not happening in that confrontational sense in the Golan, because because that's how, you know, settler colonialism operates. It tries to be working in different intensities in different geographies as part of its differentiation of colonialism. But yeah, I think this is where Makaniya offered us. Omar's intervention with Makaniya was in the way that he has also, along with colleagues, kind of framed Palestinians being on the land in different areas and different farmlands in the West Bank that are themselves being transformed completely by Palestinian neoliberalism as well. So there is kind of that double-edged or the double-tiered struggles that are being faced by Palestinians who want to stay on the land in ways that they know, in ways where they feel they are embodying, you know, ancestral knowledge and tradition and practices and growing crops that sustain not only them economically, but sustain their existence on the land and their sumud and perseverance. But also being faced with that confrontation of, we also need to change practices because there is a market and there are new neoliberal models that are compelling us to do things differently. So how do you stay? How do you? What's your makan? What is your embodied presence in those cases? And again, the Golan Heights offers also similar reflection and analysis because. But it's also very limited because the lands are confined, and the water crops, and the apple crop itself has been a lucrative crop, but it also has its own problematics that I can speak about later maybe. But it's also compelling farmers to reconsider relations with the land and values of the land, and putting them in very difficult situation where they have to make very difficult decisions on whether to continue farming or not even. So yeah.
Thank you. It's interesting. We've been reading about how settler colonial projects tend to have those national parks set up on stolen, right, or Native American land in the US or in Canada, afforestation under the newly created Israeli state on destroyed Palestinian villages, how the environment is used and manufactured to hide those realities, right, through an ecological aspect. So the Jawlan is very representative of that. But also you mentioned the relation between capitalism and colonialism and settler colonialism, which come hand in hand as well. I'm going to move on to the questions, the online questions. I'll take two of them. The first one is from Shifa, who is one of our students today, unfortunately was sick and wasn't able to attend. I will summarize it. She's asking, how effective are resistance efforts, according to you? We read this week that the West Bank is at agricultural capacity. Is that true? And what other avenues are out there outside of agriculture to reclaim the land? And how is helpful between, quote unquote, the international community? That's the first question, Mona. The second one is from Iman. Thank you so much for being here. I'm working on an assignment about youth efforts to support one another during this genocide. You mentioned farms set up in the West Bank and near Ramallah. Are there particular names of groups, people you would recommend I look into to learn more about youth movements for food, water sovereignty? And we know that food and water sovereignty are also means of resistance in the context of genocide.
Yeah. Thank you. Both are really, really good questions. And I'm happy. Yeah, the second one is a bit like straightforward. So I'll start there. So yeah, like I think again the efforts that people have been like working on, how do you say, yeah, like they don't stop basically. And I've been in touch with a couple of those efforts. But the one thing that it kind of shows is that how much Palestine has been also framed as, you know, as a site of humanitarian need, you know, at a site where interventions are needed to come from top down, they need to come from international aid agencies, they need to also address issues that Palestinians don't have a say in. And what is actually being shown to us, how the complicity of many of those international aid agencies and the complicity of the governments that fund them, is that once the genocide started, is that the hypocrisy was laid out, exposed completely, and this is where what happened is that people relied on each other. They relied on their knowledge of the land. They relied on growing food in very, very difficult situations. And the late martyr because of that was Youssef Abu Rabia, who was in the north of Gaza and who refused to become refugee in the south. He refused to be expelled from his land, basically. And he remained there. At the beginning, there was no food, but then he found seeds from his greenhouse and started propagating those seeds and growing food. But the sad, of course, reality is that he was also killed, a few weeks ago. But he resembled that kind of youth. He's an engineer. He was an engineer that was really not waiting, for anyone to give aid, but devising their own ways. So when it comes to the West Bank and Ramallah, I think this has also been a way. There's been a wave of that enlightened work where rejecting the framing of security, securitization of water, securitization of food, understanding very clearly that this is a settler colonial project that is not stopping. So reclaiming that right to be on the land through different means, agriculture being one of them. So I mentioned Sliman was one of them. I should have written it, but I can send all the details. Sliman farm, for example, there are many ecological farms that have started, now popping up in different areas of the West Bank, where it's young graduates coming out of university that is very much, also a neoliberalized institutions also in Palestine, where they are put out there to the workforce and there is no jobs. The jobs maybe require you work in Israeli settlements or you work inside Israel as builders of their settlements, or growing food on Israeli agricultural land that is stolen from Palestinian. So there was a complete rejection of being part of that system and a return to land as little as it is, as small as it is, to grow their own projects of agricultural production. So Saqiya is another example of a project that is decolonial in its kind of vision in terms of knowledge production about land and Palestine and land-water relations, and that centers, traditional knowledge and traditional philosophies as well. So there is a lot that is happening on the ground, specifically in the West Bank, and even in Gaza. There was also a lot of different initiatives that were promoting agroecology in Gaza. That sadly, of course, now are all dispersed and destroyed. But people remain who will keep on finding ways to do the work. And that question is now gone. But what I remember.
The first question is about other means of resistance besides agriculture, knowing that the West Bank is at capacity, and how helpful is the international community?
No, of course. I think this is such a great question, to be honest, because if we look at how agrarian transformation and agricultural sector transformation has happened in Palestine, that it has become highly commercialized, highly export-led, and it's catering to an export market that is completely stifled for Palestinian. It depends, highly dependent on Israeli border crossing, for example, highly dependent on aid. So the aid agencies have actually developed this high dependency solutions to address food insecurity and to address, well, basically not food insecurity, but mainly they were interested in economic prosperity, in trying to showcase examples of success. Like I said before, there is the aid framing of water issues was the idea to increase availability of water, right? Through any different means that doesn't really conform with Palestinian liberation struggle, also future vision, right? So the idea was that let's increase your water availability through means of making you highly dependent on Israel, rather than achieving your water sovereignty or your access to resources. Same is happening with food, where like aid agencies are also interested in models where a neoliberal agenda is being supported, where also the beneficiaries of those are like large landholders, not the farmers that are completely struggling with settlement encroachment on their land, for example, or the fact that settler attacks are heightened in specific areas in the West Bank, where again, the international aid interventions are not visible. They're not there. So it actually goes back to Palestinian civil society and mutual aid and different forms of support Palestinians do. So I agree that agriculture is not only means of being on the land, and also what I wanted to say is in agriculture is very much now in the service of providing produce for Israeli market, unfortunately, as well. So there is a lot of things to unpack in the agricultural sector in Palestine. And there is a lot of networks now that aim to expose that and aim to understand it a bit better. But agriculture that serves sovereignty is one that is needed, and that, as I mentioned, those initiatives are actually talking about it. It's about sovereignty over food production, sovereignty over whatever is available for us to claim as water rights as well, and also kind of a rejection of a model of agriculture that is very extractivist, that is being, as I said, like supported by the international community and to the benefit of Israeli economy as well. So yeah, not only agriculture, but being in place through different ways and through different means could be a way. But again, it's very, I will say only this very quickly, but it's very difficult because the Israeli settler colonial logic as well is about being in place means you need to be present. So you need to plant trees. And this is what the Jawlanis in the Golan Heights did, is they were compelled. Of course, they wanted to plant trees, but at a certain point, they were also compelled to plant trees to justify or to claim the land as theirs. Because a barren land, a land left with no, productivity, is considered, it can be easily be confiscated by Israel. So you have that double-edged sword where you want to claim rights to the land by being inland without the idea of like producing and benefiting from the land, but at the same time, you're also compelled to do so. And this is what happened in the Golan Heights. This is what happens in the West Bank as well, where the olive tree becomes such a prominent tree throughout the West Bank because of the need to show presence. You cannot show presence if you don't grow or you grow like seasonal vegetables, for example, or you grow baladi products. That is not a present that is, agreed to, or like in the eyes of the settler colonial logic and imaginary. It's not a present that ensures, that you own it. So there is a lot of, again, we can unpack that a lot as well in terms of property and the colonial logics of property and ownership as well.
Yeah. I'm going to turn to the classroom. Yes, Archit and Latifa, and then Rory.
Hello, Dr. Dajani. My name is Archit. I'm a journalist from India, and thank you for your wonderful presentation. Over the past few weeks' readings, it's been getting more and more clear that there are multiple forms of resistance through agriculture, but also in other forms as well. And my question is not specifically related to agriculture, but in broader context of the ongoing genocide and the everlasting occupation. It's difficult, like I've been very young, I'm very new to this occupation. I've learned all about occupation over the last 1 year, and when I read scholars like Dr. Daoudy and yourself, I can't even imagine how frustrating it could be to do it again and again, and we are at this point where it's terrible. So my question is, how can resistance outside Palestine reshape itself, reimagine itself? And to that extent, I'm going to ask you a slightly difficult question. LSE has not divested. And how does it feel to be associated with LSE? And as long as such associations exist within our academic framework, will we ever see the end of occupation if we do not change our methods of resistance? Thank you.
Going to take a couple of questions, Mona, before we handing it back. Latifa, please.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Dajani, for being here with us. My question is in relation to your chapter with Tistel, and you both touch on how the forced integration of the Jawlani agricultural product into the Israeli markets creates a complex economic dependency. So how do you assess the impact of this on this economic structure on the Jawlani community and their autonomy, but also on how they manage the environment?
Yes, my question is related to advancements in technology and neoliberal models have changed how farming is conducted across the world. Are communities in the Jawlan, relative to the occupation, able to access these new technologies? Has it changed the way they farm and the way they interact with apple trees and agriculture in general? And if so, have these advancements in technology opened new makanayat? And I was interested that you briefly mentioned that apple farming is now becoming problematic. Could you speak a little more to that?
Lot.
No, these are such great questions, to be honest, and they come at the heart of what I'm interested in. But I also I like echo this idea of or this frustration or anger or the lack of the helplessness in a way when you kind of try to repeat and repeat again or share kind of research on Palestine, but feel at the same time that it is yeah, it's such an apocalyptic conditions that we are living under, and that Gaza Palestinians are experiencing so violently that how can we even comprehend, how can we make sense? How can we actually speak? And I've really struggled to speak for a long time, even find the right words to articulate, that frustration. So I agree with you around this question of, how do you actually cope and how do you continue? And I think one thing that has kept me kind of a bit focused is to think about how it's a time of confrontation, and it's a time of building mobilization as well, even in academic circles that seem to be very much banal, and the academic institutions have proved to us that they do not operate under the ethos that they claim to be operating under. They have also become such neoliberalized machines of, and they have also contributed to warfare. They have contributed to technologies of warfare that is being actually implemented against Palestinian populations, but also now in Lebanon and elsewhere. And LSE actually has proven to showcase the entanglement of academic institutions with the climate breakdown, with fossil fuel industries, with war technologies, and the military industrial complex, and also genocide. And it has really opened such a very dark reality, not only at LSE, but elsewhere, about the realities of our institutions and their complicity. I would say the only beacon of hope is that it's mobilizing students at such a great rate that also, of course, the US has spearheaded on the students have spearheaded on different campuses in the US, and that kind of had that wave of encampments also in the UK. But for example, I would say the student staff assembly at LSE have produced a 160-page report on how LSE is funding apartheid. And it has exposed so much, and it allowed other staff members to become mobilized, the ones that weren't. It has allowed also students who have been misinformed or have not been interested to kind of understand things more. So I think that is kind of the role outside of Palestine remains for academics and researchers and Palestinians to kind of make those linkages and strengthen those networks that are being built very, very powerfully. So it's not a moment of how do you say, privilege type of, I would say maybe for a few decades, the climate movement has had that kind of apolitical stance that we are trying to address climate change together. There is a sense of universal issue that we want to address together. But then now, actually, the climate justice movement is talking about, what's going on in Palestine in very clear voice. So I think we all have a role to play in kind of shifting the narrative more and more, and for that narrative of liberation to become normalized, and put to the side, all of that acquiescence to the status quo and trying to find solutions that are apolitical, or that kind of continue the business as usual, or continue with Israel being allowed to do what it does, not only in Palestine, not only in Gaza, but also in Lebanon and also elsewhere. So that, I think, will maybe concern the question on the resistant and LSE, and the question on apples. And I really because I'm really grateful, Marwa, again, for this opportunity, because it kind of allowed me to come back to that work that I really admire the Jawlani people for spearheading an apple sector that is very much at the core of it was, a chance, an opportunity, or no, a necessity to claim rights and existence on the land. However, what happens, and what usually happens in such dominant and hegemonic settler colonial structures, is that this has to happen through accepting the settler colonial state and institutions. So what happened, I will start with the technology, say that, well, of course, Apple sector has adopted many of the technologies that are being adopted by the Israeli farmers, because you had to compete in a very economically unequal and also ideologically unequal setting. For example, the Apple Producers Association is based in an Israeli settlement. So from the get-go, you are faced with that hurdle of it's not only an equal opportunity for a Jawlani farmer and an Israeli settler farmer to market their products, and the Jawlanis have found ways to kind of make sure that they will stay afloat. For example, they built very big coolers based from their own funds and own capital. They developed their own water infrastructure and compelled the Israeli company to secure them, to sell them their own water, but at least they built the infrastructure, so they didn't leave any excuses for the Israeli company to say that, oh, we cannot provide you with water. So they reclaimed water rights through those means, through infrastructure, through water coolers, and through marketing to Palestinian markets. And that happened in the 1970s and 80s, and it was such a celebrated and such a very proud moment of solidarity between the two struggles that are, of course, not really separable at this point, because the Jawlanis and the Palestinian, especially in those decades, when Israel has been intensifying their grip over land and resources, they have found that they support each other in so many different ways. So there were very strong markets, even reaching Gaza, even reaching the Jenin and Nablus and so many other areas. And they are still existing today, those networks of support. And you cannot imagine how much people celebrate when they get the Jawlani apples in Jerusalem or Golan Heights. Yeah. So that emotive, connection cannot be really described. So yes, I think why I say that it's problematic, it's because Jawlanis have also found themselves in a highly competitive market and highly ideological market that favors settlers and settler colonial farms, and the land becomes a burden. The land becomes a burden for the Palestinian and for the Jawlani, because they are trying to find an equal footing in a very unequal condition, both because it is very much a neoliberal market-based, promotion of their products, but also because it is ideological. It's basically they don't want them to succeed. And I have written about it a lot. If you want to have a look about the Jawlani apples and how to this extent the land becomes a burden and the apples become a burden. How do you keep them? You don't want to also destroy your orchards because they mean so much to you. It's part of your identity. But at the same time, how do you keep on? So that struggle for agrarian communities under settler colonialism is quite like an existential struggle. So the Golan Heights, when the wind turbine project came to their life, some people accepted to rent their land for the project, Israeli project, settler project, because they didn't see any prospects for the apple, for agriculture. So that logic of like costs and benefit starts being prevalent amongst any group within societies that are looking at it like in more black and white, while other continue to kind of hang on and see kind of the clear underlying, you know, yeah, like tropes of like racist tropes, colonial tropes that are being inflicted upon the people who remain steadfast and all that. So that's why I say the apple crop is problematic, because this is what's happening with the older generation, while the younger generation are maybe looking for other ways of being on the land, which maybe comes back to that other question about, is agriculture the only way? So people are trying to find different ways, but the important thing is to remain on the land, remain present, remain visible, but remain dignified as well.
Latifa's question, do you want to
repeat it?
there was also Latifa's question about, do you want to repeat?
Yeah, I can repeat my question. It was about how the forced integration of the of Jawlani agricultural products into the Israeli markets creates some sort of economic dependence. So my question was, how do you assess the impact of this on Jawlani autonomy and their environmental management?
Yeah, so yes, on the Jawlani autonomy, because what happened also in kind of somehow switching and committing to the apple production and the apple tree production is that, as I mentioned, they have become part and parcel of Israeli system, and to even to the extent where the language, you know, spoken amongst farmers is in Hebrew, for example, because they are like in need to kind of speak with authorities and speak with marketing personnel that are Israeli, or kind of try to sell their products also through those means. So it has caused that shift, you know, in perspective, and a lot of Jawlanis have seen that this has really reduced their struggle in a way, and altered it in so many different ways, that to make it more like accepting of the status quo. It has compelled them, for example, to start water associations that are registered in Israeli as Israeli cooperatives, for example. So it pushed them into a certain acquiescence, let's say, like a bit of forced acquiescence into the status quo of being part of the system. And that is also building up, you know, that a bit of grievance, a bit of like speculation around, you know, how viable can it be. So I don't know if that answers the question, or if you meant something else.
Yeah, you know, the apples from the Jawlan have a very important symbolic meaning for the rest of Syria. They were known as the best apples in Syria, and I believe for a while they used to be still sent to inside Syria. In the 70s, there was an agreement with the Americans, because there was a form, and Jawlanis always feel connected to the rest of Syria at the time when they were able to communicate, you know, through the fence. I believe this is not the case anymore. But there's an Israeli narrative that they're Druze and that they're sort of settled in Israel, which actually is not true. They still uphold their identity as Syrians very strongly, and the Arabic and the fact of not being, they were annexed illegally by the Knesset in the early 80s, but they still uphold that relation to Syria and the fact that it's an occupied land. And the symbol of the apple, like the orange for Palestinians, is a very strong symbol in Syria as well. Interesting.
Yeah, no, that is all, yeah, very powerful, and it kind of always been spoken about, you know, that legacy and that history of apples, you know, starting in the Golan Heights, but they were, of course, all like supported by the Syrian government at the time before the occupation in '67, and how Jawlani apples were being exported to the Gulf countries. Like it was a thriving agricultural practice that people thought, okay, this is a thriving practice, but it also now it's a need, it's a necessity after 67 with lands becoming, easily confiscated by the Israeli state. So definitely that connection has always been told and retold 100 times. And even there is a few movies or films that I recommend people watch. I don't remember them now name by name, but I can send Coco maybe the names, and if you're happy to circulate, because I feel like also like the Jawlanis believe, and it's true, there are two types of apples that originated from Syria, and then the apples that are grown today are not. They are like Israeli saplings. So that is kind of was something that I worked on in the PhD as well. So that is really interesting, also to think what apples and what meaning do these apples have versus, the apples that are now just marketed, but they are also a way to stay on the land and to preserve it.
So Coco said she will kindly circulate whatever
Yeah.
recommendations you have. Yes.
Perfect. I will share them. I'll
Yes.
collect.
Thank you for that. Any last questions? Yes, Kate and Lara, and we'll finish on these two, and Samra. It's taking a lot of your time.
Thank you so much for coming and speaking to us today, Dr. Dajani. I was wondering, you spoke a little bit about the kind of developments of sort of neoliberal systems and infrastructure within Palestine. And I was wondering if you think that those sort of inevitably contribute to this greater interdependence with Israeli systems, or is it possible that those projects could be kind of consistent with the regaining of Palestinian sovereignty? Or do you think that sort of true sovereignty would require a sort of diversion away from those neoliberal practices?
Lara?
Yes, thank you so much for coming. My question is basically, it's just a clarification. You mentioned earlier that like living under occupation allows you to find ways to be more creative, and then you talked about renewable energies and wind energy. I just wanted you to elaborate a bit more about that because I'm really unfamiliar and I would love to know more. Thank you.
Thank you. Samra, yes, and that will be our last question for today.
Hello, thank you for being here. My question has to do with the hegemonic power over ideas and viewpoints. As you mentioned, it's a time of confrontation. Today, we're starting to more clearly see the hegemony over ideas and viewpoints, in particular in Palestine and Israel, and the genocide and the occupation. When it's not so clear, for example, with America and the way America deals with the rest of the countries, how can we debunk the prevalent viewpoints?
And we're living a very special day today, waiting for the result of the US elections, which will have an impact on us living in the US, being at Georgetown, to go back to your point, Archit, as well, about divestment, all of that, but also the rest of the world, right? And Palestine more specifically, and Gaza more specifically. So the floor is yours for the last few minutes of our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. These are also like great questions, a bit difficult, the last one, but I'll think, I'll find a way. But so I know what you mean. Your question about like the neoliberal systems and also kind of ways of attaining sovereignty through them or not. I think just a general maybe comment around that is that I think in the case in settler colonial context, there is an aggravation of inequality built into the system, right? So as other agrarian societies and other maybe marginalized communities or indigenous people are grappling with, neoliberalism in the way they kind of conduct their agriculture and the way they produce the way they produce agricultural products, for example. It's already been kind of exposed that there is a big fracture. There's a high inequality, and then if you add to that a context of ongoing, like belligerent, very violent settler colonial project that not only contributes to dependency, I think it also forms alliance with a very small elite, Palestinian elite, that are like adopting the neoliberal, and it is the Palestinian Authority. At the end of the day, the Palestinian Authority is kind of the authority that has been assigned by Israel to manage the population, and also kind of make sure that, you know, there is the resistance and the liberation that is not on the agenda in a way. So I don't know. I feel like I also haven't studied, let's say, the new forms of like neoliberal agricultural production in, let's say, in the West Bank specifically, to say something about it. But I feel like maybe they can contribute, but they have to be done in such a conscious way to achieve, you know, liberation, because it can easily fall into the trap of consolidating, exacerbating inequalities that already exist. So I would say that, for example, all that move to kind of develop export-oriented crops, even in Gaza, can you imagine that in Gaza, the agricultural sector has been dependent on exporting strawberries and flowers to Europe? Like why? Like why, for example? But this is something that is really important, because if we actually look at it, we say that it has contributed to Gaza's economy, for example. But what we see today is it has left Gaza as well very highly food insecure, because first, that dependence, the lands that were productive were turned into export-led production. And also, second of all, a lot of farmers who wanted to achieve food sovereignty under the very difficult circumstances, you know, water being unfit for human consumption, water being highly brackish and highly polluted, trying to kind of preserve on, you know, traditional baladi products in Gaza was a rarity, you know, and I feel like our intentions, our emancipatory potential of agricultural work is not by finding, you know, those caveats in neoliberal systems that will help us, you know, get somewhere, but in rejecting, you know, dismantling, rejecting. And I feel like this is kind of the sentiment of the moment. The current moment is that these structures have proved to us they don't care. They dehumanize us. They don't care about our life. They don't care about our ecosystems and our knowledge and our existence. So one way is to kind of completely reject and completely dismantle the systems, you know. So I hope, yeah, that answers the question. And the question about renewable energy, I think it's really important that Palestine and the Jawlan are becoming sites of like new geographies of exploitation by Israel, because of the fact that they can control, you know, the land, and they have hegemony over resources. So in the Golan Heights, they see it as a strategic location for wind turbine development, that it doesn't really take into account that Jawlanis are living on those lands. So on the 5% of the land left for them, while, you know, the expanse of the Golan Heights is not enough for the renewable energy projects, or in the West Bank, where a lot of areas also are turned into solar farms. So renewable energy here comes at, it's a double-edged sword, but very, very bad sword on both edges. Because at one end, it's used by the international aid community to depoliticize issues in Palestine, say, oh, well, you need access to more energy, or you need access to your well, we'll just put a solar panel, which is great, but it has to be done, again, with an emancipatory position and a forward-looking idea towards liberation, not to just put a band-aid on issues. So this is where renewable energy becomes very problematic. It's either very much commodified to serve a small proportion of the population, to serve international aid agenda that normalizes the occupation, or it is used by Israel very violently in taking over land. And both are highly problematic, but there remains small spaces and openings, again, as always. The settler colonial project is not complete and it's not successful. And that gives us hope that reclaiming rights to resources is on the horizon, and it's something we should all kind of continue to believe in. And I think on that note, you know, I think what's happening. How do we debunk those viewpoints? I think we are equipped with so much knowledge, and we are equipped with so much lived experiences, whether, you know, historically, contemporarily, and future of a lot of marginalized communities, not necessarily Palestine, but communities that are at the forefront of climate change as well, that are coming together, you know, that are kind of sharing not only that intergenerational trauma and loss, but also kind of looking for a future where we can really achieve justice, you know. So I think that is something that we should be using to debunk the viewpoint, is that we are equipped with knowledge and with clarity today, especially after 2023 October, is that we are faced with a clarity that there is a hypocritical world order, and a very violent one at the same time, and the one that needs to be dismantled, and the one that needs to be continuously confronted on multiple levels. And I think you as students offer so much hope, you know, so much hope, because without students like yourself carrying out the encampments, taking that leap of faith, and going there with the full kind of conviction and belief in the justice of the Palestinian cause, that we didn't reach this point where we are producing reports on our universities' complicity, where we are exposing their very dark sides, and asking for accountability. So I think, yeah, like, just continue learning and continue making sure that yeah, your voices are heard, and yeah.
Thank you so much. Dr. Dajani will end on that note on justice, resistance, and emancipation, hopefully liberation. And I want to thank you so much for joining us for a brilliant lecture and brilliant answers, also a discussion. And we wish you all the best in continuing your research under conditions of occupation and in the context of a genocide that is unfolding as we speak. But hopefully we will move forward with the agenda that you're prescribing to us. Please join me.
Thank you so much again. Thank you, Dr. Marwa, for the invitation, and thank you for everyone in the class and also online for such a stimulating conversation. I really, really, truly enjoyed it. And yeah, it's giving me a bit of hope in those very dark times, and especially for those in the US in such a very, very tense moment. Yeah,
we have wonderful students. I have to say, that's as you said, the glimmer of hope in that very dark period. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.